And tonight we're going to have a great presentation from Matt from Septic Check Inspections. It's going to be all about septic systems in our lakes, and hopefully we all get some good tips. I know I'm looking forward to learning some stuff about the septic system I have here on my property. Just as a few housekeeping things before we get started, the session is being recorded. We are asking that you stay muted and that you keep your video off for the duration of the webinar. This helps with our bandwidth, and it also just makes sure there aren't any distracting things happening in the background as we're watching the webinar. If you have any questions for us or for Matt, go ahead and use your chat feature. That is found at either the bottom or the top of your screen, just depending on how your Zoom features work. You can type that right into the chat to everyone. We'll do our best to get to everybody's questions. If we know the answer during the presentation, myself and my co-host tonight, Gloria, will try to answer those for you, but most likely we'll be leaving those for our expert, Matt, at the end. And tomorrow you're going to receive an evaluation form from us. Please share your feedback. We do like to hear what maybe went well, what didn't go well, what you thought of the topic. If there are other topics that you'd like to see, I'm always looking for new and interesting things that our listeners are looking to hear about for our lakes. You're also going to get an email from me tomorrow morning that's going to have all the links to the webinar recording, so you can share the slides or the recording with anyone who you think might be interested that wasn't able to tune in tonight. Just a little background for those of you who maybe don't know much about New Hampshire lakes. We're the only publicly supported nonprofit organization working for all of New Hampshire's 1,000 lakes. You can support us by becoming a supporter today right on our website. And it is National Invasive Species Awareness Week. So if you do go there, you'll get a nice pop-up right on our homepage, right with a donation link front and center. It's our mission to keep New Hampshire's lakes clean and healthy now and in the future. We work with partners, promote clean water policies and responsible use, and inspire the public to take care of our lakes so we can all enjoy them. We do that through 3 programs. First is our advocacy program, and it's right in the middle of the legislative session right now. So if you are interested in our advocacy work and want to lend your voice for your favorite lake, you can reach out to Michelle Davis. She's our advocacy and policy program manager. We also have our conservation program that's probably most well known for our lake host program, which is helping to make sure boats aren't bringing in or taking invasive species out of our lakes. You can see our lake hosts at boat ramps throughout the state. And our other outreach, our conservation program, is our LakeSmart program. It's a little bit newer, but it is starting to become more popular. It's a voluntary program where any homeowner, whether you live on the lake or far from it, can fill out a simple survey right online from your house to sort of get things rolling. It'll ask you some questions about things you might be doing at your house and on your property. It will let you know immediately with a personalized response what's maybe LakeSmart and maybe what you could improve on. And then you can do a follow-up with us to come visit your property if that's something that interests you. And we do hope that everybody will be LakeSmart, so please check that out. And then our outreach program, which is bringing you our webinar series that you're tuned into tonight, as well as other outreach programs like our Lakes Congress, which we are planning right now for this spring. It'll be Friday, June 3rd. So please do save the date for that. We're your hosts this evening, myself, Erin Mastine. I'm the Outreach Program Coordinator, and we have Gloria Norcross with us. She's our Conservation Program Assistant. And our expert presenter tonight, Matt, he's the owner of Septic Check Inspections, and he's also a New Hampshire Lakes LakeSmart service provider partner. So if you are interested in LakeSmart and you need some septic work done, please do reach out to Matt and he can help you with that. So I will at this time stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to let Matt take over from here. Hi, Matt, welcome.
Hello. Can you hear me first of all?
We can hear you and I see your screen. It looks great.
Perfect. I am Matthew Raumikaitis of Septic Check Inspections. I've been in the industry for about 8 years, and I've owned the company for about a year. So let's dive into this presentation. All right, so here's a little overview of what we're going to cover. It will include, so first for you to understand how our septic systems affect the lake. We have to look at system components and some common concerns that we find with them and how they can affect the lake themselves, and some preventative measures we can take to make sure that we have less of an impact on the lake itself. So we'll go over the system components, some of the common concerns, the risk of some of the concerns, the causes of a failure of a system, which is a more immediate effect on the lake. Some site challenges, especially around lakefront properties where we have, slope, water is a big challenge for septic systems, and then some preventative measures. So in simple, what is a septic system? Septic system, and there's so many various things out there that kind of how a septic system can be set up. But tonight we're just going to look at the very basics. So everything in the house, it's going to drain out into your septic tank. From there, on a lot of the lakefront properties, we're going to have a pump chamber, and that's going to pump the effluent or the liquid from the tank up to a drain field, whether it's to push it away from the lake, push it away from ledge, get it away from property setbacks, or even pump it out to a community system. And then you have your EDA, which is there's many different types of systems that could be. Most common is that we're gonna find these days is pipe and stone or the Presby environmental systems. So first of all, the tank, you have liquid that's going to flow in from the house into the inlet. And then you have an outlet. That's where the liquid's going to flow out to your, whether it be pump chamber directly or out to the leach field. You have a scum layer. That's the layer that's going to float on top, the stuff that's not as dense, so it doesn't sink, it just floats. You have the sludge layer. And that's going to be all the heavy solids that just sink down to the bottom of the tank. And in between, you have the effluent layer, which is liquid. It's going to have small particles, small solids that are, suspended, floating in it. And the way the tank works is liquid comes in. You have the inlet baffle here that's designed to slow down turbulence within the tank so it doesn't stir it up every time you flush the toilet. Very important. Some people feel that they're more of a nuisance. They're worried about it causing a clog in that baffle itself. But at the end of the day, the best thing for your system is to have that baffle stop the turbulence and let the solids settle out the way they're supposed to. Again, at the outlet, we have the outlet baffle. In either of these baffles, they can be PVC or concrete, which are the current styles we have out there. The outlet baffle, it reduces the solid outflow into the tank or pump chamber. So liquid self-levels. So typically the solids are going to stay up towards the top or down at the bottom. If you don't pump your tank enough, then you can get the scum that'll start to work its way underneath that baffle and then out the outlet pipe. Um, many systems these days today are have an effluent filter installed as well. These effluent filters are an optional based on the design. Although I do think they're a great idea in every case, I really do want you to talk to a designer before you just go and have one installed, because there are certain airflow requirements on systems, and things like that. Uh, if you have one of those filters should be cleaned at least once every year. And although it wasn't required uh, for the full past, in the last couple of years, it has become required to have an access riser that brings the cover of that tank up to grade, um, direct access, so that you can clean those at least once a year. So some common tank concerns I see: missing baffles. We just talked about how the baffles are important, both the inlet and the outlet. If you look at the pictures here in front of you, this one here, this is actually, um, they added an addition over their garage, and they put in I believe an apartment above that particular home. And somebody put in this inlet baffle, or put in this inlet to the tank. However, there's no baffle on it. So every time you have this liquid rushing, in this case down a hill, it was stirring up the tank. And if you look at the picture, you can see that the clarified water here, it's pushed the scum layer away, and with that turbulence. You have another baffle here. This is an old style baffle on a round tank, where the baffle is actually part of the cover. And over times of pulling the cover in and out, and age and corrosion, the bottom of that baffle has fallen off. So if somebody's not fully paying attention to what's in that tank, they might say, "Oh, yep, the baffle's there." But you can see that pipe there, and in this case, is an outlet pipe. So this actually allows the solids to flow out into, in this case, it was a dry well. Some other baffle things we see. So this image over here, and I know it's tough to make out. It is a old school 90-degree cast iron. It doesn't have an airflow point through the top with some of the conventional baffles. If you look at this one, airflow can pass through here, but we don't have that airflow here. And airflow is very important to the septic systems. A tank is septic. It doesn't have airflow except for at the surface, unless you have one of the pre-treatment tanks, aeration tank. But the leach field does require to have that airflow. It really needs that oxygen to help treat the fluid. The other thing we see here is there is some root growth that's coming in around that pipe. So in that case, I don't remember if there was trees nearby or not, but we do recommend trees stay away from tanks, leach fields, pump chambers, so you don't get a blockage of root growth. The other thing that should happen here is the tank should be sealed. The root growth can't get into the tank unless there's a small opening, which means that the liquid, the wastewater, can flow out of the tank at that point. So that's, although it may seem minor, is actually a fairly major thing, and especially along our waterfront properties. So some other things I see often are damaged or unsafe covers. Some of the old school tanks, the covers didn't have enough of a taper to them, and through the years they'd start to sink down into the tank. And if they're shallow enough, you could be walking across one and it could drop out from underneath you. In those cases, we would recommend that you install a riser that'll seal the tank, it'll secure the tank, and you'll have easier access for servicing of the system. You have a picture here. At some point, the original cover probably fell in, and they used some pieces of deck boards across the top. And although pressure treated, the wood will eventually always break down, especially buried. There's a lot of moisture down in there. It's a corrosive environment, and it just tends to rot out wood even when it's treated. This particular one, they had a piece of fiberglass over the top as well, and then it was backfilled. Really not a good setup, really an unsafe setup. And unfortunately, I see that way more than I should. The other thing I look at is how is the structure of the tank. A lot of times we're looking at the sidewalls to see if there's cracks up the sidewalls, if there's cracks in the concrete baffles. That can be an indication of a problem, or that liquid is actually leaking out of that tank. In this case, this was the top of the tank was fully exposed, and we had cracks coming out from the corners of the covers, and there were additional cracks on all of the covers. But in this case, we had this. Um, this was in an area that was, even though we don't recommend driving over them, it was a plausible location for somebody to drive over. And in that case, becomes a safety issue. Uh, what I don't know is if there was additional damage within the tank. But even in this particular situation, I did recommend a replacement of that tank. One of the other things I see often on these tanks is that they're not maintained. A lot of times people feel that, as long as they're adding the Ridex, they don't have to have them pumped. Ridex and other products like that can be helpful, but you should not require, the system should not require those to properly function. So I've seen tanks that haven't been pumped in 20 years. Basically you drop a rock in them and it just floats on top. Those are systems that many times I find in distress down the road. With that being said, a lot of our lakefront properties and many of the people that I've already done work for, they're seasonal use properties. So they don't necessarily have to be pumped every 2 to 4 years, which is a typical recommendation. You could push it out. If you're renting a system, if you own a property on a lake or even a river that you rent out, Airbnb, vacation rentals, then I would recommend pumping those systems at least every 2 years, because you don't know what those tenants are going to do in the time they're there. Some of them may be on a city system, and they might be flushing everything down there. You really want to make sure you take care of your tank, take care of the entire system. The other thing I see is clogged effluent filters. In many instances, I find that people don't even realize they have them. And these are going to be more so on newer style homes, where the pumper hasn't been there recently and they just have no idea. But many times these filters, they, like I said in the last slide, they should be pumped, or they should be cleaned at least once a year. My father, for instance, cleans his every 6 months. He wants to make sure that there's no backups and that there's proper airflow through the system. The other thing is, many people rely on the pumper to clean it, but unless you tell the pumper to clean it, they're not going to go for that cover. They're not going to pump out of that cover. They're not going to open it. And this is another reason why they really want the riser covers installed where the effluent filters are. It's a reminder to that you need to get that serviced. Um, so from the tank, again, some systems will have a pump chamber, others will be gravity. Um, you'll have the effluent will flow out of the tank and into the pump chamber. That would come in here. This shows a baffle. There won't necessarily be a baffle. There's not really a requirement for it as long as there is a baffle on the outlet side of the tank. So most pumps we see these days, it's a single pump that's going to be set up on a block. And that's just so it doesn't get the solids that eventually build up in the bottom, and water flows in the top, in the bottom, and then it'll pump out and up to wherever your leach field is located. In some cases, I have found them where it's not actually up a hill, it's just, 200 feet in the other direction, and they have to get it to that location. So typically, not shown on here, you're going to have a high level float switch that'll trigger an alarm. So if for some reason the pump fails, you will be alerted at the home. Nowadays, they have wireless alarms that can actually send you a text or an email, which is great for seasonal properties, or again, if you rent them out to our vacationers. That way you can get something taken care of before it becomes a major issue inside. Typically, you should have an alarm located in a accessible area of the home. Sometimes they're outside, sometimes they're inside, sometimes they're in the basement. But you do want to make sure they're accessible to a point where if there's a problem, you can either hear the siren, because most of them have buzzers or a siren, or you see the light flashing. A lot of times what I recommend in a seasonal property is that you have an outside alarm. That way, if you're not there, maybe a neighbor will either hear or see the alarm going off, and they can contact you to get things taken care of. Left unattended, you could end up with, the wastewater backing out of the top of the tank. And that's nothing we want. We don't want it at the top of the mountain. We certainly don't want it near a lake. Some of those systems are timer enabled. So basically they'll run for 5 minutes if the floats allow it to. Some systems they'll set, you'll have 2 floats down bottom, and it'll pump 150 gallons at a time, multiple times a day up to your leach field. And again, similar to the effluent filter requiring a riser, the pump chambers also require a riser these days. That's in case, again, you have a failure of that pump. You don't want to have, and it's honestly for the service guys, you don't want them to be in there trying to locate and dig out that pump chamber, while there's water bubbling up. They want that direct access so things can get taken care of very quickly. So another thing this shows is the vent. A vent is sometimes required and sometimes not. It depends on the venting of the entire system. Most systems we see these days will have the vent. And although I know they're very ugly, especially on scenic property, they are very important, again, to the airflow through the entire system. So some common pump concerns that I've seen, again, I already talked about damaged or unsafe covers, cracked tanks, that all of that stuff stays the same to what we talked about in the septic tank itself. Um, I talked about pump alarms. Uh, Many of the older systems don't have them. I highly recommend them because you want to know when you have a problem and when you need to take care of something. And again, I recommend the newer styles that can send you that text or that email in case you're not there. Many times I see poor electrical connections, whether it's, open wire nuts right inside, um, or even open open junction boxes. It's a sign of sloppy work, first of all, but it also has that risk of if your pump does fail and you have that backup, you can end up by shorting things out, and you may not get the alarm. You may not know anything. Um, and again, it also creates that electric electric the electric shock risk for any servicing company that comes out there. The other side of it is again within the tanks and the pump chambers. It's a very corrosive environment. A lot of times, those connections that are unprotected, they get oxidized, and you don't have a great connection. So I've seen in some instances where, well, why isn't the pump triggering? And you kind of poke at the wires a little bit, and it starts to go. Um, so it's really one of those things you want to make sure that those are in good condition so things are working properly long term. And again, talked about the risers. Risers are definitely very, very important. You can see this image here. This is there was a riser installed here, but it was still 2 feet down to that riser cover. So in this case, it was one that I recommended they add a riser to come up to grade so they could have full access. You can see on this image down here, you can see the top of the pump here. There's some soil that's through the years has worked its way down, sitting on top. This red float is that pump alarm float. So that's that high level meter. Looking in this particular tank, you don't have staining over this point right here. And then you have the float switch that turns the pump on and off right here, that little gray thing right there. So that'll flip up. When it flips up, it'll kick the pump on, and when it flips back down, the pump will shut back off. You can see that video running up top. It's actually a lakefront property. They were going for their LakeSmart award. And this was where the pump chamber was pumping up to. In this case, it was into a distribution box or D box, but the D box was so full of root growth that it was pushing all of that fluid up out of the ground and then causing it to run down the slope. So definitely concerned that I know they took care of it. They actually ended up by replacing the entire leach field because the leach field itself was overgrown with 6-inch trees. They didn't really realize where the leach field was, so it was a little explorative when I was on site there. So again, either in some cases from the pump chamber or from the tank, you're going to flow into the EDA or the effluent disposal area. So most systems will have the distribution box or the D box, as we call it for short. It's going to depend on the type of system, how the system's installed. There's many different factors there. If you have a pressure distribution system, which is the leach lines within the leach field are actually pressurized by the pump. Um, I don't see many of those often. I do see them. It drives me nuts trying to look for the distribution box that doesn't exist. So this image you see over here, this is really a basic drawing of a more conventional pipe and stone system, where you have the distribution box, and in this case, you have 3 lines out. There'd be backfilled with stone to allow drainage down through that. But at the same time, some of the newer systems, whether it be an Elgin, Presby Enviro system, um, or even a chamber system, you're typically going to have that distribution box, and again, separate lines coming out of it. So pipe and stone system, 4-inch perforated line. Newer systems are going to be PVC. Some of the older systems are going to be Orangeburg, which is a pitch pine and wood pulp pressed together into a pipe. Not really a great product, but it was popular after the war when materials were at a minimum. It's kind of like putting paper mache in the ground. Once you have all that liquid around it, it's eventually just going to break down. We typically see that anything built 70s or sooner. And what happens when that breaks down, collapses, and you don't have the fluid going where it should go. Again, I talked about the vents. The leach field is really where the vents are important. You really need that airflow through the system so that everything can be treated the way it should. The leach field is really an area where bacteria can grow and again help break down that waste. So some of the EDA styles, we have the common day leach fields, whether it's the pipe and stone systems, concrete chamber, plastic chambers, the Elgin or the EnviroSeptic systems. Those are all what we would consider the conventional systems. Older systems, which again, you're going to look mid to some late 70s and earlier, you have the dry wells. Dry wells are typically a pit dug into the ground, typically surrounded by block concrete. Sometimes I see stacked field stone, and then they typically have some sort of cover across the top. Sometimes that cover is not very good. A lot of times I'll have a steel plate that through the last 50 years is all perforated or ready to fall in. Now that becomes a safety issue, and you at least need to take care of that, the top of that tank, or top of that dry well. What we look for in those is a little bit different than what we look in the conventional systems these days. We expect to find fluid in these dry wells, and it's a matter of how much fluid, what's our overall space within that system, and where do we see that evidence of that liquid getting up in that dry well. Some of the dry wells, as you see here, they have an overflow trench. So they'll have a pipe leaving that dry well that'll typically go into just a single line pipe and stone trench that's 2 feet wide and goes out 10 feet. It's a sign that there was, previous stress on the system, although some systems were installed originally that way. And again, a seepage pit. So whether somebody's calling it a dry well or seepage pit, it's really the same thing. However, a seepage pit is going to have that pit, but it's usually going to be filled with crushed stone, or I've seen, 4 to 6 inch stones that fill that pit, and it lets the liquid drain down through. The trench lines, they're either going to be old school, or if they were installed more recently, it was typically a homeowner install. I see them a lot. I've seen them in situations where, um, we replaced our septic system, but it was just a trench line. Um, and although they are popular in other areas of the country, they're not so popular in New Hampshire. You can do them, but you have to have some waivers involved with that. Um, Cesspools, still occasionally see them. Um, and again, that's a dry well. It's essentially a dry well structure, but there's no tank or treatment system before that. So it goes directly from the house right into that cesspool. So all your solids and everything end up in that cesspool. Uh, some cesspools I've seen, they've been 12 feet deep, 5 feet around, stacked field stone, with a concrete cover over the top. Um, Not ideal. It does not treat the fluid. You have a higher chance of getting bacteria, the nitrates, and the phosphates to work through the ground surface and out further because you don't have that treatment. So some of those common EDA concerns. Uh, One of the most common problems I find is the distribution boxes. Um, I know not all of the evaluators in the state look at them. There's no requirement to look at them, and actually during the class they say, don't dig them up, because they're more worried about if you're digging them up that you're gonna damage them. Um, so it really depends on what we see on site to what we look at. So some of those common boxes are common concerns we see are collapsed or partially collapsed D boxes. This first image here, so this is a D box where the cover has actually caved into the D box. Uh, and first of all, these D boxes, they're typically going to be about a shoebox size. Um, some of them on larger systems are, maybe 4 shoeboxes put together, but they're really not big things. Um, so in this case, this one is caved in. You can see the concrete sitting down here. You can see the soil from above that's worked its way in. You can even see some root growth over here. So what happens in this case is all the fluid is going to come into this D box and it's going to go out this one line right here. Well, that's not very good for your septic system, and it can cause a failure on just one side of the septic system while the rest of it appears to be unused. Unfortunately, when you have a failed system, you still have to replace it. Again, this is another D box. This is one that we were very shallow, easy to get to. We popped it open. The cover had already been replaced at some point. So you can actually see the outline of the distribution box here. And you can see all these solids and soil and root growth that has built up within that D box. That's some solids that have worked their way out from within the tank. Some of that stuff is because the D box was so shallow, soil when it rained was able to wash into that distribution box. Again, causing a situation where as the liquid comes in here, it goes out that one line. One of the other things I see is that they'll be unlevel. So much like if you have a blockage, as in one of these, all that fluid is going to flow out one or maybe two of the lines, while the other 2 or 3 lines are barely touched. And a funny story, I actually opened up a D box one day, and one of the installer's coffee cups was sitting in one of the outlet lines of the D box. It was not allowing fluid to work its way out there. So of course I pull out the coffee cup and goes in my trash bucket, and you just have to laugh at that point. Root growth is a big thing. This was actually from one of our uh, NH Lake Award. I believe they got the award out in Molten Borough. They had tons of root growth within the D box. Um, you know, you can see they had the sealant up here on the cover. That's great. Again, not a requirement to have that, but it's a nice touch. So this also tells me that some of this root growth was coming into the distribution box where the pipes entered the distribution box. So it told me that they did not properly seal around that box. And in this case, some of that root growth was also coming from the leach field itself. It was coming up through the pipes and was growing into the D box. And I don't know if it's just my luck, but I typically see more root growth within a distribution box when it's receiving its fluid from a pump chamber. And I don't know if it's because it's not a constant flow of liquid, because it's, timed out or dosed out. I really don't know what the science is behind that, but one of those common things I say. When I find something like this, I try to clear out as much of that root growth as I can to make sure the system's working properly. And then I recommend that the D-box gets sealed up. Another common thing I see within the EDA, working away from our D-box is collapsed crushed or settled systems. So you may have you can see in this bottom photo here, this is a pipe. This happened to be a vent line that was crushed. But if you end up with this in your leach field, you may not have proper flow. I can't see what's past this. It may be filled with soil and you're not going to get that proper flow through the system. In this case, you're not going to have the proper airflow through the system, especially on the style system this was. Many times I'll find the Presby tubes are crushed. So they're foot in diameter tubes. They're wrapped in fabric and they're surrounded by sand. They help treat and filter the fluid as it drains away. Those tubes, because again, they're plastic and they're round, a lot of times can become crushed, typically by the installer doing backfill, contractors driving over the septic system. I've seen it all. Even occasionally putting a pool over the septic system. Just don't do it. It's too much weight for these systems to handle and you're going to cause damage. You have plastic chambers, which one of the common things I find with those, especially some of the older systems, the pre-1998 systems, essentially they're half round pipes that set on a bed of sand. And what happens is over time is they'll start to sink into the sand and you'll lose the capacity of the leach field. Again, common. Sometimes it's caused by vehicular traffic over the top, but a lot of times it's really just gravity. The newer plastic chambers, they have larger, what we call feet or pads in the bottom of them. Some installers will put them up on blocks so that they don't sink in, but there's definitely ways around it these days. The other thing is concrete chambers, which I'm going to say is common on our lakefront properties. Usually you're going to have those restricted lots, trying to keep things away from the water, the setbacks, the wells. So a lot of times those concrete chambers or even the plastic chambers get located underneath the driveway itself. Designed to be done that way. But even with that, those will start to settle in if the base of the septic system is not properly installed. If you have a massive amount of weight in just the concrete chambers, add some gravel, add some pavement, put cars on top of it, and gravity does its job. Um, so, and again, that reduces the capacity of those. Um, if you have concrete chambers, the vents are required for those. Many times I find them, they don't have vents on them. And okay, back in the 80s, even the early 90s, well, maybe they didn't get vents put in. They didn't realize how important they were. If I do find a chambered system without a vent, I'm always going to recommend you add that vent. Is it going to cost you a little bit of money to do? Yep, but it's better than a replacement of the full system down the road. Many times, a little bit more often within the last couple of years, with more people working from home, less time at the office, more use on the home system. I have found saturated or failed leach fields. So this is a picture of a couple of them. So this is more of a field note here. My foot's on the squishy ground, and as I'm stepping on it, the liquid's just bubbling out of the ground. We have this one here where the fluid is, in this case, I think it was 3 or 4 inches until it came out. And it was, soft in the area. We'll talk a little bit of how those systems become saturated. So you have the biomat, which is a black slimy layer that forms on the bottom of the leach field. Typically thin, but through time and use, the thickness will start to grow. That biomat, it actually filters out the viruses and pathogens within the wastewater. So many people feel that once it leaves the tank, it's just out. Well, no, the leach field actually does treat and filter out stuff, and that's why the sand that they specify for our septic systems these days is very important. So over time, as that use increases and that biomat thickens, the drainage of the system is going to start to slow down. It's going to retain that fluid longer. So if you keep having the same use, or if you increase your use on that system, it's going to take longer for that liquid to start to drain through that biomat. Eventually it will stop. All systems will eventually fail. The newer systems that actually are designed to treat and filter the fluid, our Elgins and Presbyterian Viro systems, they are, and the manufacturer says it, they are designed to fail over time. It's designed for the fabric on them to clog up, for the biomat to eventually build up so high that you just don't drain, they fail. So one thing we can do to help the biomat not build up so quickly is a lot of times the reason it builds up so thick at times is the amount of solids that work their way from the tank out into your leach field. This is partially why pumping the tank is very important. You don't want those, like we talked about in the first few slides, you don't want the solids working their way out into your leach field and clogging it up. That's why we don't recommend garbage disposals. You can design a system to have those garbage disposals, but the tank is typically going to be 50% bigger. Sewage ejector pumps, yep, we got to have them. In many properties, that's going to take, say you have a bathroom or even a sink that's in your basement and it's below where the outlet line is from your house. Well, they got to pump that up somewhere. Typically, they're going to have a grinder pump, and it's going to chop up any solids that work their way out into fine particles that stays suspended in that effluent level in the tank, and eventually it forces the way out. So again, for garbage disposals and the sewage ejector pumps, uh, they really want the tank larger to be able to handle that. Now, if you have an old school system or an older system that hasn't been designed for it, pump your tank more often. Another thing you can do is, again, talk to a designer because there's airflow requirements in certain systems. You can have an effluent filter installed. Here, you can see that pictured. This is one of many styles. You can see where the solids have built up on this. This is one that hadn't been cleaned. I think it was in about 18 months. Definitely recommended cleaning of this particular filter. Uh, challenges of our lakefront properties. So oftentimes we're on restrictive small lots. Setbacks are encroaching, setbacks to the surface water from the house. If a lot of times we have ledge, wells, neighbors, and groundwater. A lot of our properties are set down by the lake, and the groundwater is right there. So a lot of times, even if they are part-time or seasonal, or I guess with them being part-time or seasonal, oftentimes that maintenance is overlooked or forgotten. So even though I said you could stretch out your pumpings a little bit longer, please don't go more than 6 years without pumping them. You really want to make sure that those solids come out of there so you don't end up with problems down the road. And it also gives a chance for that pumper to take a look inside that tank, make sure your baffles are there. If you have a filter, make sure that the filter is getting cleaned. Oftentimes, lakefront properties become a gathering place, or again, they get rented out. So even though they may get limited use at times, they may get overused, over the course of a weekend or even a week, as they get rented out. And unfortunately, many times visitors or renters, maybe they come from the city or maybe they just don't care. They're gonna abuse the system, hour-long showers. You don't know what they're gonna do. But one of the biggest challenges of a lakefront property is the water. I already said it a few times. Your waterfront property, you have wells, groundwater. It all creates potential issues long term to trying to set a leach field onto that property and have it properly drained. Now, there's ways around all of that with waivers and some, in this case, aeration tanks or pre-treatment tanks. So advanced on-site solutions, I believe they're in Concord, and I believe they're a LakeSmart provider as well. They have some treatment systems that will help treat the fluid. You can typically have your leach field a smaller size, and they can really go a long way. Unfortunately, some people don't like them because many of them will use energy. They'll have air pumps. So it's not a passive system and it runs their energy bills up a little bit. Or if the power goes out, but it's the same thing if you have a pump system, you're still going to have that energy draw. You have the proprietary systems. There's many I haven't seen, but like the Elgin and the Presby Enviros, those are still proprietary systems designed to do a certain job. So if you have a pipe and stone system that's so many square feet, in many situations you can have a Presby system or an Elgin system that takes up a third that space, and that helps you with those setbacks. Again, the pump systems, you can pump up away from what you're trying to get away from. And then you have what we call ledge tanks, typically a shallower tank, sometimes only 2 feet. in capacity, depth capacity, but they're going to be a larger area. That's one way to work around water tables or ledge on the property. I feel that risers are very important. I think they're not, a lot of people don't like them because they don't want the green cap in their yard, or they don't want the concrete cap in their yard. But I do believe that they're a reminder to maintain your system. And I also feel that they reduce the soil disturbance every time you got to dig that up. And then it rains again, and that soil will wash away, especially if you're built onto a lot of the slopes that we find. And obviously around lakes, we don't want that erosion down into the lakes. If you're renting a property or you have friends over, post septic safe rules near the toilets and sinks. Make sure people aren't flushing things they shouldn't. If you don't normally have a trash can in your bathroom, add one. Add one with a cover. It might make people feel better about throwing things in it. Again, install a high level alarm on your pump chamber that it's going to alert you of any issues. Again, I really like the ones that email or text you, especially if you're not there. The other thing is, I also highly recommend having periodic inspections performed. Every 3 to 5 years, and a typical tank pumping is not going to give you that same level because they're just looking in the tank, or they might just be looking in the tank. You want to make sure you catch any problems you may have before it causes a larger issue or backups into the house or a failure, because we just don't need that to happen. So with that, I don't know if there's any questions that have popped up through my presentation.
Hi, Matt. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. That was a lot of really good information for everybody. We do have some questions. We're getting close to 8 o'clock, so we'll try to get through as many of these as quickly as we can. We have Charlie who's asking if you know if there are any New Hampshire state laws for the time period that these should be pumped, because they're thinking about proposing a town ordinance for anything within 250 feet of the lake to be pumped every 3 years.
There is no state requirement. I am aware of other communities, not necessarily in New Hampshire, but throughout the country that do require, pumping sometimes some are every 2 years, but I think some are also every 4 years, and you have to provide documentation of pumping to the town.
Okay, so it is possible. We have Caitlin who's wondering if a homeowner can design their own septic system provided that they can get it approved by an HDES, or does the entire design installation process have to be done by someone who is licensed?
That I don't fully know. I am not a designer. I'm also not an installer. I'm just an evaluator. I can certainly find out that information. I don't know if that's something we can add to your website later on as a follow-up thing, but I can look that up. That way we know.
Yeah, we can try to add that to what we do at the end of these is we also include the chat list.
Yep.
So I can wait until we get the answer and add that to that document before we upload it to the website. Okay. Warren is asking if a major septic system failures can be seen or smelled. Are there ways to monitor water along shorelines to detect any septic systems that are leaching phosphorus into the lake through groundwater?
Um, so usually, yes, you're gonna know if you take a walk out in your property and you end up in that mushy spot. Um, that's an indicator, or even if it's getting close to failure, you can get that. The smells, if you have one that's in failure, you're probably gonna have that sulfur smell, that poo smell, walking around the property. Uh, but in some situations, you get that smell anyway, so you don't want to make that connection to, right away that, ooh, I smell something, ooh, it must be in failure. In that situation, you want to have somebody come out there, check it out, and confirm one way or the other. Um, you know, we have many systems, they have the vents, and you're going to get odors out of them occasionally. If it's something more constant, you could have a clogged line somewhere, a clogged vent line. It's forcing, you know, the entire smell out of one location.
Okay. Let's see. Scott Parker is wondering, do access risers prevent groundwater from flowing into the tank through gaps around the concrete cover? I imagine this would reduce the demand on the pump, especially with seasonal systems when nothing is coming from the house.
Yes. So if they're installed properly, one of the reasons I like the plastic styles, whether Polylock or Tough Tight, is because they do get sealed to the tank. They get sealed between all the sections, and the cover is sealed itself. Um, Unfortunately, I see lots of times they're installed poorly and they're not properly sealed, and there's still water coming in. Installed properly, they do keep the water out. Um, and again, another reason why I highly recommend them.
Great. Is there a particular laundry soap that you recommend? And what do you have to say about people using bleach in the laundry?
So that's always a touchy thing. So I don't have a particular laundry soap. Um, I know there's the seventh generation, which is a bit more natural. Um, you want to make sure that you keep to liquid detergents, whether it's for your dishwasher or your laundry machines. Powders will clump, they'll cause clogs, it'll force, again, it can force that out into your leach field. You have the pods these days that the, of course, the appliance manufacturers all recommend, but they're not good for your septic system. Again, you have some of those pods are powder, some of them are liquid, some of them are both. But that that skin doesn't necessarily break down all the way, and that can end up by causing clogs in your system.
Hmm.
Um, as far as bleach, you know, don't use in excess. If you need to sanitize something, use it. Um, I'm not one to say go dump it outside, because that's not as good either. Um, but a little bit of, if bleach ends up in the system, it's going to end up in there. Um, and I don't know, take a poop after. That's going to introduce that bacteria again. But you definitely don't want to be using it in excess, and that's true of all chemicals. Whether it's pine sol or whatever, try to limit what is going down the drain.
Good advice. Okay, we are running a little bit over 8 o'clock, so if you're okay with answering a few more questions, I'll try to get through a couple more if that's all right with you.
I could sit here and talk all night.
Okay, so we'll do a few more. Um, do you know if tank pumpers can do inspections?
Uh, Many of our pumpers do inspections as well. Um, so yes, most can do it, or they work under the license of somebody else. And they've theoretically been trained.
Okay, and it looks like this might be our last one. So what does a typical inspection cost?
So that's always a difficult question. Um, you know, I charge based on where you are within the state, based out of my central area. I do cover the entire state. I'm based out of Pembroke. I kind of have that 93 corridors, my central, and as you get further away or up to Pittsburgh, some of those prices get pretty steep. But I do try to stay within the market. Um, However, it really depends on the company. There's some people out there that's still charging 250. If you get up to the Pittsburgh area, you're gonna get charged 600. If you're out in Hanover, again, you're looking at, and I don't remember what my prices are over there, but other companies are charging, you know, 450, 500. So it really depends where you are in the state.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we got through all of our questions, so that's great. Thank you so much again for joining us tonight and giving us this great information. And this will be on our website as well as our YouTube channel for people to go back and check it out. So I hope you have a great night and thank you for joining us and thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.